the Southport killer, Axel Rudakubana, is set to be sentenced in the next few hours after, of course, he pleaded guilty to murdering 3 young girls and attempting to kill 10 others with a knife at a Taylor Swift-themed dance class last July.
He was 17 when he went on his killing spree, and that means technically he is not eligible for a whole life sentence where he would never be released from prison. He is going to receive a life sentence, but there will be a minimum term likely to be set before he could possibly be considered for release. We're joined by Katie Amess, daughter of the murdered MP Sir David Amess, who was stabbed at his constituency surgery in a terrorist incident, as well as retired Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, the former lead for the Prevent Counter-Terrorism programme, Sir Peter Fahey, joins us from Staffordshire. Thank you both. Katie, we're going to talk to you about the resonance of this case with the death of your father, the murder of your father, because there are parallels which must be very painful for you. Just want to talk about that sentencing issue first with Sir Peter Fahey. A lot of people, Peter, will be thinking, how on earth, in this case, doesn't this man, and he is now a man, not get to spend the entirety of the rest of his life behind bars? And wonder if you can just explain that to outraged, shocked viewers.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but essentially there's a quirk in the law and the way that a life sentence is used and a whole-of-life tariff, which means it doesn't apply to somebody who was of this age when he committed that crime. And clearly, in the nature of modern crime and criminality, it is a complete anomaly. Politicians have known about it for a good while, and they should have really dealt with it. You know, there's no question that whatever happens, this man will spend the rest of his life in custody. But the families and the wider public should have that reassurance, and it should give a very clear signal, absolutely, that there's no question that the justice system has decided this man will spend the rest of his life in prison. So
just to establish, because you referenced it there, under the technicals, because he was under 18 at the time he committed the murders, that means that a whole life sentence can't be given. But he is likely to spend the rest of his life in prison, because once the minimum term might presumably be 40 years or 45 years or longer, and he may not even be considered for release, safe for release at that point.
Yeah, but, you know, there's no guarantee of that. If it was a whole-of-life sentence, that would be really clear. It would be the court and the public at this time giving that very clear signal to whoever would be a Home Secretary in 40 years' time. So, you know, there is a complete anomaly, really, about this issue about 17-year-olds in the criminal justice system and the difference between when you're 16, 17 and 18. And that really is something that Parliament really ought to clarify and deal with.
Katie, in the case of your dad, the killer was given a whole life term. What does that mean in terms of justice for you?
Well, obviously, first of all, I just want to start by saying that my heart is broken for the families of the poor little girls that were tragically killed, and it's unbearable to think what they're going through. So I wanted to mention that first. I know a small amount of what it feels like, but obviously I don't have a child. It's never happened to my child. So that must be a whole other level of just unbearable pain. And the country grieves with you, and we support you, and we will fight for you and justice. In terms of the guy that did it to my dad, obviously he was over 17 and he will spend the rest of his life in prison, which is exactly what should happen in this case. There shouldn't be a likeliness of the man spending the rest of his life in prison. There should be a guarantee that he will never, ever walk free. And that needs to be something that the people are guaranteed, because you cannot have somebody like that being released. And what kind of a message does it send to everybody else that might be thinking of doing something and then not have to spend the rest of their lives in prison? The similarities between what happened to my dad and this case here are just stomach turning. Prevent was monitoring both of them. Members of the public reported them to Prevent. Prevent them took them under the scheme. In my father's case, they took the guy out for coffee, asked him if he was a terrorist. He obviously said no, and they let him back into the system. He made a mockery of the scheme in court. He was basically laughing and said, well, of course, I just said I wasn't a terrorist and they let me go. So obviously you just tell them what you want them to hear. What kind of a system is that? It's not foiling any terrorist attacks. It's allowing people to commit these crimes. And these aren't isolated incidents. We have the London Bridge stabbings, the Streatham stabbings, the friends that were stabbed in a park in 2020, the guy that detonated a device in 2017. People are owed the respect of answers as to why this government-funded scheme is failing. And the only way to do that is through having inquiries. And I have been pushing and pushing and pushing for an inquiry from the Conservative government and from now the Labour government. I tried to take the government to court. I tried to take the police to court. And every door that I knock on just gets slammed in my face. Nobody wants to take accountability. Nobody wants to delve into what happened and try and figure out how we can stop it happening again, which means that we're going to continue to see these terrible, evil acts occurring, and we're doing nothing to stop them.
Well, we know that Sir Peter, as the former head of Prevent, has some very concrete ideas about how we can move forward with that. But just before we ask him about that, I do want to just touch base with you on something on a very human level here. When these tragedies come out of a clear blue sky, they must be almost impossible for people like you, people like the families of these poor little girls who were killed, the 12-year-old boy in Birmingham. Very, very, very difficult for them to process. You've had a few years to reflect on it. How do you set about making some kind of sense of such a random act of violence?
You can't ever make sense of it. You just have to try and live with the pain and the trauma, and it just plays through your head every single day. And in my case, I am committed to fighting to find out who made these grave mistakes. And I'm going to make sure that they are held accountable, because they're telling me it was an admin error and that's why he wasn't followed up on. I do not accept that letting a terrorist go is an admin error. Right. That is a grave, grave mistake, and somebody has suffered a terrible death because of it. So I will find out who did it, and I expect them to be held accountable for a full, open inquiry.
Right, well, let's come to Sir Peter then. Sir Peter, what are we going to do about Prevent? Do we just rip the whole thing up and start again, or can it be fixed?
We've got to be really clear about Prevent, which is essentially a rehabilitation programme, which is trying to prevent somebody developing the thinking, which is then means that they're going to take that into violence. That is different from a monitoring programme or a surveillance programme where you have police officers and members of the security services doing things like following people around, getting into their computers, investigating their associations, that sort of thing. And the fact is there is a massive gap between the number of people that are of concern to the security services and could be planning attacks and the amount of resources they've got. So that needs to be dealt with and looked at by this inquiry. And then really what we've seen in recent years is Prevent has got more and more out of date, because certainly when I was involved in it, after things like the London bombings, the tube bombings, that was at a time when you had Al-Qaeda, where there was a very clear ideology about why people wanted to commit these sorts of offences. And what we see in the case of the guy who's going to be sentenced today, very confused ideology, overlap with mental health, all those sorts of things. So, and for the victims, it doesn't really matter, does it, for the families? No. But the trouble is, and really as the Prime Minister identified, we need a different programme, which isn't just looking at this narrow definition of terrorism, but is looking at the wider threat of people who commit violence and are a real threat to our community. And even today, you've highlighted the real threat, for instance, of knife crime, 12-year-old boy murdered. Yesterday, a man admitted to killing 3 members of one family. He was known to the police and the authorities. So, there's this wider threat of violence, and just having Prevent focusing on what is a very technical, narrow definition of terrorism, it's no longer fit for purpose. And also what you need in these cases is all the agencies working together, not just this one programme under counter-terrorism policing, but you need all the agencies in one place working together, sharing that information, coming up with strategies. But ultimately, you need more resources for the police and security services to be monitoring and following and investigating really serious people.
Peter.
Thank you, Sir Peter.
Thank you very much indeed. And Katie, thank you for sharing your experience. I can imagine that times like this are particularly difficult for you and your family. We really appreciate you joining us this morning. Thank you both. There is a statement from the Home Office. They said they would publish details next week of new reforms to the PREVENT programme, but they also need more independent answers on both PREVENT and all the other agencies that came into contact with this extremely violent teenager, as well as answers on how he came to be so dangerous, including through a public inquiry that can get to the truth about what happened and what needs to change. He's going to be sentenced in the next couple of hours.
Yeah.